places, and I had to go from one of these sites to the other. When I finally heard that our town was giving out appointments on Friday, even though, as I say, I am reasonably computer literate, I had my son do it for me because he's quicker than I am. He is the kind of person who prides himself on having gotten tickets for every hard to get concert, getting tickets for World Series. And I figured if anybody can get a vaccine appointment, he can. And it worked. What is Cameron doing? He has built a site, New York City vaccinelist.com. I'll put it on the chat later. But any of you who are in New York who have older relatives or relatives with underlying conditions, New York City vaccine list will be a godsend for you. And I cannot say how much the world should appreciate what Cameron's doing. Now, Cameron, do you want to tell us anything about your company or the vaccine list site or that? For those of you not in New York, you might want to copy his idea, because I've read people on Twitter saying, I never would have gotten my mother an appointment without vaccine list. And I think it's just such an important, worthwhile thing to be doing. So Cameron, I turn it to you. Is Cameron here?
Yeah, it looks like no. I'm just in the chat now trying to see if he's still here, and I don't. Oh, let me see. Maybe I need to.
I don't know. In any case.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's still here.
Oh, there you are.
Hey, sorry, my internet dropped a couple minutes ago.
Okay. Did you want to say anything about your, are you hiring? Are you, do you want
to? Well, Naomi, first, thanks for that super generous introduction.
Looks like you might have dropped again.
While he's doing that, our next event will be March 10th. You're on? Our next event will be March 10th. Richard Brath will be talking about visualizing with text, new ways to think about text and visualization. And the announcement for it will be up by tomorrow morning, either tonight or tomorrow morning. I'll post it. So it's March 10th, 4 weeks from tonight. Cameron, you're muted now.
Okay. Yep. I don't have anything more. We can get started with Ben at any point, I think.
All right, then if anybody is hiring, please put your name, contact information, and that in the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Jones, who will be discussing closing the great data literacy gap. Ben is the founder and the CEO of DataLiteracy, which is a training and educational company that's on a mission to help people learn the language of data. He's the author of a number of books: Avoiding Data Pitfalls, 2019, Data Literacy Fundamentals in 2020, and his most recent book was Learning to See Data. Many of us know Ben through Tableau Public, and now it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Ben.
All right, thank you, Naomi, and thanks, Cameron. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to be back with the Data Visualization New York Meetup group. Naomi and I were chatting just at the beginning before getting the session started about how we actually, about 7 years ago, presented back-to-back, and it was in New York at that time. And so it's nice to be back and to be able to present to you all again today. So thank you for the invitation. And I want to talk about a topic that to me is really important. This led me to leave my position at Tableau, heading up the Tableau public platform in order to try to do a little more than what I was able to do there, to hopefully bring about an era, right, where we can speak data more effectively to one another, and hopefully where that will happen at a level of equality that will help bring balance, to our society. We see the lack of that balance right now, and I think data can be a driving force to help us right some of those wrongs, if you will. It's important for us to look into that and to see what data can do to help us right the ship here. So that's my perspective. That's my ultimate goal. And so I did leave Tableau a couple of years ago, a little more than 2 years ago, actually. And I started to run this business, DataLiteracy, at DataLiteracy.com. And so we're really just working with individuals, teams, groups, nonprofits, government agencies, trying to help them figure out what they need to do to get past some of the barriers and hurdles that they have been experiencing as it relates to data literacy. And so I want to talk about some of those barriers today. I also want to talk about how we got here. So it'll be a little bit of a journey, maybe, where we think about what got us to this point, and where we've come maybe more recently, as well as hopefully, what we can do now differently. I want to leave you with some concrete tips that maybe we can consider. I'd like to also know if you have ideas or suggestions about what each of us can do to try to close this great data literacy gap. First, I want to try to convince you that that exists. And then I want to talk about how that relates to other gaps that we've closed in our lifetime, as well as just in general, where society has gone. Yeah, no need to convince me. Thanks, Julie. And by the way, do feel free. I got the chat right here. So if you want to chime in, give your thoughts, we'll have questions at the end. But if you want to pose questions as we go, I'll try to keep an eye on that. If I share something that reminds you of something else, then feel free to share that with the group in the chat. Links are great. And like I said, I'll keep an eye on that too. And yeah, if we bounce off of the slides, that would be probably great, wouldn't it? And I'm open to that, and actually that usually makes for an even better session. So I, a couple of years ago, published this book, Avoiding Data Pitfalls, with John Wiley and Sons. I know Steve Wexler's on the call, and he's also worked with Wiley. And so that book was all about really, me realizing that I was, as I was teaching people to use specifically Tableau, I was noticing that they were falling into a lot of the same pitfalls, common blunders that many of us fall into when working with data. And so that book was an attempt to try to catalog, if you will, some of those common pitfalls, whether those are data visualization pitfalls or otherwise. As you know, working with data, we might have issues with the preparation of the data. Maybe it's dirty, or how we've worked on it has resulted in some issues. And so, it could be a statistical error or an analytical error. It could be an emotional error. The way we present, how we share something might actually get in our way of achieving our goals. So there's lots of different types and forms of pitfalls. Since I launched this business, we've been able to publish 2 books under our own publishing arm now, the Data Literacy Press. And so probably had a little more time to write last year than I thought I would, certainly with no travel and no lot of other things. But we did get 2 books out there, Data Literacy Fundamentals, as well as Learning to See Data, just a couple months ago. Learning to See Data is really my attempt to try to help people become better at reading and interpreting charts and graphs. So we come across charts and graphs all day, every day now. And there are many people out there that actually are super intimidated by that. And they don't really feel like that's a language that they speak and that they're really fluent in. And so I want to try to help people just at the beginning, just say, hey, when I see a chart, I know how to approach it. I know what to do, how to look at it. I understand some of these different types and shapes and encodings and ways that this visual, this graphic representation might be actually telling me something about what is in the data. So I'm really indebted to Tamara Munzner, Dr. Munzner from University of British Columbia up here in Vancouver, not far from where I live, 3 hours drive north, as well as her illustrator, Eamon McGuire, who I believe is based out of Switzerland. And so they've put together in a graduate level course textbook called Visualization Analysis and Design, a really great, I feel, kind of diagram that you see here on the center of this page that describes two important principles of data visualization, and that's expressiveness and effectiveness. And we'll talk about those. And so I actually want to teach chart readers to understand those concepts so they can start to use those principles to be able to evaluate what it is they're seeing. And so to be able to assess whether or not it's going to help them answer the questions they have, carry out and conduct the tasks that they need to carry out. And so we've actually turned this book into an online course on our site. And, some people like to read books. I actually love to read books. I've got way too many over my shoulder here. I've also got one of my favorites right here in front of me, Creating More Effective Graphs by Naomi, signed copy right there. I remember reading this book and, I love the side-by-side examples. I learned a lot about how to get people to think for themselves, right? When you say, well, hey, look at it this way. What happens if we show it to you this way? And Naomi has been, I think, instrumental in helping me learn that very important teaching technique so that someone might be able to look at two different examples and assess what might be better about one over the other, okay? So not everyone likes to read books. And so some people like to actually take courses. I know I've got Stephanie Evergreen on the group here, along with one of her live sessions, classes. And some people like to have that live instructor interaction. And so, there's these different ways we learn, and it's important to give people different alternatives there. And so I try to take these principles and then kind of break it down into different forms of charts that accomplish specific things. And so, so that's out there. We cover what we consider to be the 25, most common, most useful chart types. And so, if you, have someone in your network, there's a few good resources that help them to learn this. I think Stephanie's book, Effective Data Visualizations, is also a great one. I know there's another one out here recently by John Schwabish called Better Data Visualizations. So the goal there is, can we help people become more fluent at reading charts and graphs? We know now more than ever how important that is. I mean, last year we saw for the first time, probably in the history of the human race, how many billions of people looking at pretty much the same data set, very similar charts and graphs by really a handful of most prominent news organizations and government agencies publishing views and visualizations about COVID, right? So, it behooves us all to reach out to our coworkers, our neighbors, our families, our friends, help them realize that, hey, this is something that you actually are capable of. Believe it or not, you have a brain that is really well suited to decoding these messages. And you have a visual cortex that was actually, perfectly set up to do just that. And so a lot of the teaching then is helping people realize what they already know and what they're already able to figure out on their own, and just by giving them that opportunity to do that. All right, so I want to kind of set the stage here where we are today. And we're going to go way back, okay? We're going to go over some things here that you are already familiar with and you've seen, and then we'll shake it up a little bit. In fact, I think part of the impetus to shake it up came from Stephanie, who's on the call here, challenging maybe some of us to think about this differently. But let's start with the traditional, okay? The traditional kind of walk through the history of the pioneers of data visualization. You've seen these charts and graphs many times. What I want to do, maybe that's new, if at all, is layer on top of these famous charts and graphs the broader changes that were happening in Western society at the same time these charts were being published. Okay, let me make sure I'm caught up on the chat here. Cool. Yeah. So we can start really with, this idea that at one point in time, it feels weird to think about it this way, but prior to really the formation of the United States as a country, or just right around that time, there were major changes happening in the world politically, clearly, French Revolution, the United States being formed, but also actually industrially speaking, there was what we know as the first industrial revolution, or sometimes just the industrial revolution. Well, before that, everything was made by hand, hand production. This switched to more of machine-based production. New chemical manufacturing and iron production processes start appearing. We start seeing use of steam and water power to bring people together into factories. Perhaps now this year we've seen an interesting, separate revolution about, going back to away from the centralized location to get work done, to do work done. But this was to get work done. But this was a totally different way of doing things. This was a completely different way of working together in teams of people to produce. And so at that same time, we see, our first historical pioneer, William Playfair. That's actually not William Playfair, I came to find out. That's a different William Playfair. I should take his photograph out of there. It's, I think, his nephew or something like that, also with the same name. But we know about his book that was all about showing the economic data, balance of trade. And so that was right around that time, right? In the beginning stages of this first industrial revolution. Then we zoom ahead and we see kind of in between the first and second industrial revolution, Nightingale, her coxcomb plots, helping really institute this sweeping sanitation reform, saving lives with data activism, the first time data visualization really, at least in our own society or Western societies, used to do that. We know at the very beginning then of the next second industrial revolution, the second industrial is when Menard in France obviously begins to, actually this was just right at the end of his life. People didn't notice he was 90 years old when he died, I believe. And this is when he was 89 years old, he published his famous, everyone knows it, the Napoleon's March. That was the very beginning of the second industrial revolution, when it's a technological revolution. What's happening there is that we start to see widespread adoption of technological systems, telegraph, railroad networks, an unprecedented movement of people and ideas. This kind of brings in this wave of globalization, okay, across the globe. At the end of that, kind of bookending maybe the second industrial revolution, Willard Cope Brinton publishes one of his earliest books here on graphic presentation. And so that's really, there you go, bookending this second industrial revolution, changing the world completely. We get the First World War, the Second World War, and we see sort of a hiatus there, don't we? Right in here, there's really nothing kind of at least famous happening. Certainly many things still happening, but when we see this sort of third industrial revolution beginning, the digital revolution, that kicks off in 1947 with the invention of the transistor. We start to see computer systems. We start to see this happening and changing. One of the books that comes out during that time by Mary Eleanor Spear, Practical Charting Techniques. It's still fascinating to read her book. I think I have it here somewhere. And she's actually the muse or the inspiration behind that Learning to See Data book, because she talks about learning to see beyond your first impression of a chart or a graph, being able to break it down and look closely at what's there. And her book, a lot of it is really kind of discussing still, manual graphing techniques to create charts and graphs with tapes and drafting boards and pens of different shapes and sizes. And so that was sort of her specialty within the US federal government for decades, really, from 1920 all the way through till the 70s, okay, late 60s. And so we see then also now a major change starts happening as we start to switch from Mary Eleanor Spear and her methods of drafting to the computer-based revolutions. We see Cleveland and McGill in the 80s publishing their research into this ability to, our ability as humans, as a human race, to be able to decode charts and graphs to be able of different types. Okay. And then we see kind of today, right? We see data visualization New York, right? And the fact that here we are together, and it's in a whole new era, really a completely different era in so many ways. And many people still think that third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, is still upon us, still happening. We're going to talk about how another fourth industrial revolution is being layered on, virtually on top of it. All right. So what I found fascinating to think about, though, is that, if you collapse all of that time and you compare it to the oldest human fossils, Homo sapiens, about 315,000 years ago, all the way through till now. So what does this mean, right? Basically 99.9% of the history of the human race was between those oldest fossils and Playfair. That leaves 0.074% from him until today. And that means if you started the clock back then at midnight when the fossils were found, Playfair happens at about 11:59:59 in terms of the percentage of that. So we're new at this, right? Our brains are still pretty new at this. It's still an amazing creation, but still relatively new. Now, again, what I think that Stephanie and others have helped us do, RJ Andrews, you may know him, Info We Trust, shared this recently, some kind of non-English visualizations that were happening at this exact same time, right? So for us to think, oh, it's just people in England and America and France that were developing the language of data. Well, no, that's not true at all. In fact, we can even go further afield and afoot and find people in different cultures that are creating encodings of quantitative, qualitative information, showing that in visual form. The Kipu, which is a famous kind of example of from the Incas of keeping track of numbers and counting and using that for commerce and taxation and things like that, using knots on ropes. And so these different ways that are outside of our own frame of reference is very important, as I think many people have made clear recently, that that's an important thing for us to get outside of our bubble and see the history of our species communicating data to each other visually outside of maybe our existing frames of reference. And really, again, seeing the bigger picture there and understanding that this is a movement that is widespread and something we can capitalize on there. So I want to talk about maybe our lifetimes, or at least my lifetime, because the changes that have taken place in the last 4 decades have been amazing and radical, and have really changed the nature of what we need to do today as we communicate data to one another. So if you go back to 1979, I was 1. And at that time, this software comes out called VisiCalc, which is the green and black screen you see on the left, that turned this personal computer hobbyist tool into a legitimate business tool, as companies were able to start to use personal computers to be able to conduct business. And so you can see also this commercial here, this advertisement from Apple from the 80s, early 80s, in which they're advertising something called Business Graphics, a software product that, as advertised here, allows you to turn boring tables and huge stacks of paper into visuals. And so I like, they're even more clever marketers probably than many of the marketing we see today, how to turn a sea of data into data you can see. Okay, so this was this beginning of this wave of really converting data visualization into digital form. And so that's when that kind of all began. And so then what happens along with that, we have these very compact waves of technical adoption that started at that exact same time. So in the 1980s, I was a little boy then. I was going to grade school and I was doing assignments that started off by hand. And then by the time I was done with 6th, 7th grade, we were typing them up and printing them out and tearing off the little dot matrix tabs off the sides of paper and turning that in. Now we had to learn how to do something that was really foreign to us. Use a word processor, left justifying, tabbing. What does those things mean? What are the little paragraph indicators, symbols? And how do I use this word processing software or equipment? And so that was a technological wave. We had to learn how to do that. And so you can see this advertisement here from CompuLit, which my boys first laughed about, now they've grown about. It changes so quickly, the terminology, but CompuLit was teaching people how to learn WordStar in just 4 or 5 hours, right? And it was a relatively easy adoption wave. It wasn't really that sophisticated. It was a little bit maybe annoying for those of you in my generation that remember having to learn all these new word processing techniques, but it was also kind of cool. You get to bold a font and see it turn bold. I can turn it italics. And then when I hit print, it comes out and it was really kind of cool. We never done anything like that. It was fun. But it wasn't rocket science. We were just learning a new way of doing sort of the same thing that we'd already been doing. This is some photographs of my father. He, at that time, ran his own little computer systems company in Thousand Oaks, California, where I grew up and went to school. And he would code, custom programs for people. He'd also have some of these teaching programs in the storefront there where he worked. Okay, so I remember him teaching and helping doing that. And then we zoom ahead to the 90s. Well, this is when I was in high school and college, at least me personally. You can think where you were at that time. And that was when all of a sudden now, this thing called the internet comes out. So in 1996, I left high school and went to UCLA. I'd never had an email address or a mobile phone or anything. And so by the time I was done with college 4 years later in 2000, everything was online. We registered for classes online. We got our grades online. We ordered our books from a crazy little startup called Amazon. So that was all happening in the 90s, but we had to learn how to use the internet, right? We had to learn how to use a browser, like say, for example, that one, Netscape Navigator 4.04, right? One of the earliest browsers that we were using to navigate this thing called the internet. Brand new thing. What is this? How does it work? Why are we doing this? What are we accomplishing? And so that was a new technological wave of adoption. And at that time, I want to highlight, people would put that on their resume. Hey, I know how to use, I know how to use one of those early browsers like Netscape Navigator. That would be something you would advertise on your resume or your CSV that you know how to do. And we don't really do that anymore, obviously, because this is just what we do now. And then I thought to myself, what happened after that, right? 2000 hit, we had the bubble, the .com bubble, it burst. And then right on the heels of that, we start to see social media coming out. The Facebook here, one of the earlier screenshots of the Facebook. And so all the other ones there too, same thing. Now we have to, and by the way, the other technological revolution, as you all know, that was happening at the same time was phones, right? So these are kind of in some ways complementary. They fed on each other. They supported each other, propped each other up, and fueled each other. And so now, we kind of all needed to learn, why do I need to be on LinkedIn, or what's Twitter, and what's the difference between Twitter and Facebook, and what kind of conversations do I have here versus there, and what are the rules around posting, and what you can post, what you can't post, who sees it, who doesn't see it. It was really cryptic. It was really confusing. It still is in many ways. But in any case, that was this next wave of technical adoption, social media, along with our mobile technologies. So these are skills that we needed to build. These are things we needed to learn. These are technologies we needed to adopt. But if you think about what happened kind of since then, since maybe the 2005, definitely since 2010 to now, the change really has been data. And what we have seen is a massive explosion, both in number and sophistication of data working tools. This is a screenshot from Tableau back in 2003 and what it looks like now. But that's just one, as you know, of so many amazing tools that have just come out, not only the tools, but the data and the availability of data. Gosh, I was trying to think, I remember when I was a kid, the Northridge earthquake woke me up. It was 4 a.m. I remember the whole house shaking and the pictures falling off the wall. That was pretty close to where we lived. Well, if I wanted to, at that time, study earthquake data, I would have probably had to go to my library in Thousand Oaks. I would have had to go to the card catalog system. This feels like eons ago. Now you just pull up the USGS website, and with a couple clicks, you're downloading over 100 years worth of earthquake data. So the amazing availability of data, as well as the incredible tools that we can use to be able to leverage all that data, has grown leaps and bounds. But what maybe hasn't grown is our awareness of how to use it. So that's why I feel like we are today at this point where we've got a lot of data, a lot of tools, but we're still missing the knowledge, the familiarity with these concepts and techniques, the pitfalls and the perhaps the alertness to those. And so we keep tripping up. We keep making mistakes with data, okay? But also we've got just droves of people that really feel like this has passed them by, this fourth industrial revolution. This is Klaus Schwab. He's the president of the World Economic Forum, WEF, and he has written a book talking about how this fourth industrial revolution is actually happening in line with the third, the digital revolution. They're overlapping, and so we've got this compounding of change happening. As you see here, the velocity, scope, and systems impact. Also, the fact that we're seeing blurring lines between some of these different technologies as they start to fuse together. Okay, and this is resulting in amazing things. I mean, it's unthinkable that we would have had the vaccine that Cameron and Stephanie are both working on visualizing within less than a year. That's unthinkable. And so, these available tools and data and very intelligent people to know how to use all of that is really allowing us to do things we've never been able to do before. At the same time, we're seeing this split where there are so many people that really, this isn't their thing. This isn't their language. They went to liberal arts school. They never envisioned themselves having to work with data to the degree that they do. And they're bewildered. We've talked to so many of them where they're really feeling intimidated. They're afraid to bring it up because they feel like this is so important for their career, and yet something that is not their thing. Okay. And so, there's a lot of reasons for that, right? I mean, our formal education didn't prepare us I even went to engineering school at UCLA in the 90s, and I don't even know if they taught us stats at all, maybe a little bit. Certainly, maybe I had to use Quattro Pro, the spreadsheet software, like in a couple physics labs. The rest of it really wasn't about that. It was math, it was calculus, it was working on equations, it was designing some 3D software, some finite element analysis. So there was definitely the beginning at that time of some of those techniques, but basic math, basic stats, some of the important concepts of data and working with data. That was not part of the curriculum. And that was for a top-notch engineering school, right? So this is just the case, and we've got this massive workforce that just isn't where they need to be right now. And so we see this, right? So we see data careers on the rise. This is Google search trends for the titles you see there: data analyst, data scientist, data engineer. You can put statistician in there and see where that one went too if you want. We see this growth, right? We see a rise in demand for data talent. LinkedIn Analytics, talking about analytics and data science job growth. Look at that curve. If you look at the top 20 emerging jobs, only going back a few years: machine learning engineer, data scientist, big data developer, director of data science. These are all at the top. These are, 3 of the top 5 all have to do with working with data in terms of emerging jobs. We see higher education scrambling, really. They have been for about 5 to 10 years now to fill the need that they have realized on the workforce side of their students as they go through and then send them into the workforce. They became aware of the fact that they weren't equipping them the way they needed to be equipped to work with data. And so we've seen that. When I was at Tableau, I got to work with the academic programs team, and Emma Trifari there, who was putting together and led a team to assess the growth of analytics programs by various names. You can see the orange band statistics stays pretty similar in size, right? But then you see this growth of other programs like business analytics and intelligence, informatics, data science, data analytics and analysis. These different kinds of programs start coming out. Now, this is 2-year degree programs, 4-year degree programs. But in any case, this is a scramble on the part of higher education to come up with the answer to this need. And so that's part of what's been happening. And that's great. That's a good thing. Organizations waking up to the need. Valerie Logan, she was at Gartner for many years. She has since left Gartner. She now runs the Data Lodge, where she helps companies come up with their own data literacy programs and plans and strategies. But part of her work at Gartner before she left there was recognizing that organizations were waking up to the fact that we've got to do something about this. They're not going to have the sufficient skills. this is by last year, 2020. This is what she was predicting at that point in time. 80% of organizations are going to start these development programs, some kind of program to help educate people on important data topics. And certainly, our little company has seen, and of course, we're only seeing and talking to the people that are doing this, but there are many, and I would talk about many different industries, not just companies, but also the private sector and the public sector, the volunteer sector, all of those. They're all starting to see this need to close the gap. Because here's the thing, right? The fact is, we still struggle to read and interpret charts. So Pew Research did this study of this scatter plot right here. So take a look at the scatter plot. You can see I'll just let you take a look here, okay? And there are 4 statements, A, B, C, D. And the question is, which of those 4 statements does the scatter plot back up, let's say? Which does it suggest? Or what is the statement or sentence of those 4 that you think most clearly represents what you can reasonably say from that scatter plot? So go ahead and take a look at it and see if you can, see, you all are good. Oh, Cynthia Andrews is on the, that's great to see you too, Sai. And so, yeah, exactly, it's C, right? But 63% of Americans got it right. That means 37 didn't. And I would even suggest that if you were to take the scatter plot away altogether, you'd probably have them still guess C. I don't know. That would be an interesting study perhaps to do. But we still have a large percentage of people that really struggle to understand these basic charts. And the problem is right now, as we've seen, that problem is big because that can be about life and death. How many individuals do you know in your own circle that were really struggling to make sense of the data about COVID, now the data about the vaccines that are coming out? So important for us to be able to manage our own health, our family's health, keep ourselves safe, keep our neighbors safe. And data didn't unite us the way it could have, the way it should have. And a big part of that is because people see this, they tune it out. They don't know what to make of it. It's just overwhelming. Again, they fall back on maybe what they want to think or maybe what someone else says. I mean, they're so susceptible, right? If they don't feel confident interpreting these sorts of visual displays of data, well, then they're susceptible to someone coming in and giving them a different kind of information that may be closer to what they want to hear, perhaps. I don't know. So it's about life and death now. And the fact is, it isn't simple. It actually can be very tricky. There was a really interesting study about COVID data. It came out obviously last year that talks about showing to a group of people on the left-hand side, a chart of a line chart, right? A timeline really of a linear scale deaths over time, as well as then showing another group the logarithmic scale on the right. And there were questions about the data that has been shown to them. So with the linear scale, 84% were able to answer that correctly. 40% answered the logarithmic scale chart questions correctly. And, I remember logarithmic scales, log charts, log linear charts, those would be almost universally, about a year and a half ago, okay, almost universally recommended against, showing a large public audience. Very few people I know in the data viz world would have been saying that's a great idea. But yet, well, when you have something that expands and spreads exponentially, in some ways, that is the most appropriate way to show it. And so now you have this gap. Here's the most appropriate way to show it. Here's the percentage of people that can understand that. We have a problem, okay? And so graphicacy is one part of it. It's not just that though, there's also numeracy, graphicacy, numeracy. Numeracy being just the ability to understand numbers, percentages, rates, things like that. So actually, if you look at US adults, particularly where I live, where you all, many of you probably live, you can see on the right-hand side here, a list of countries. US is fairly low down here in terms of the numeracy scale for adults 16 to 65. And this is a few years old now, but in any case, we're seeing that this country isn't particularly strong when it comes to being able to interpret numerical concepts. And so, this is another issue here in this country. A couple links there in case anyone's interested in following up and reading some of those studies. So we got these two overlapping concepts, numeracy, graphicacy. And to me, I see data literacy as being kind of in the middle there. We'll come on to more of that in a minute. And I actually asked Alberto Cairo, you all know Alberto, to do a little paragraph for the book 17 Key Traits of Data Literacy, which we published back at the beginning. We launched the business a couple of years ago. But he talks about this idea of, being able to have numerical and graphical literacy. But also, I love this quote if you take a look at it, because he really highlights the fact that it isn't just the math. It isn't just technical skills. It isn't just knowing stats. But actually, there's this sixth sense involved. It's grasp, even a tenuous grasp of these concepts. So, there is almost this element of working with data that we need to acquire an intuition, a gut feel even about the data and what might be issues with that data, to be able to kind of have a sense of where we might need to go with it, what we might want to avoid with the data. So these are intuitions that we're trying to still build up. I sort of look at it like, remember going back to that timeline, back to the fossils. So in some ways then, if that's true, that this is all brand new, working with massive quantities of data in digital form like that, then we're really the infant, in some ways, kind of starting with data of the species and trying to learn to crawl and then hopefully walk with data. But it's probably a multi-generational thing. I don't know if this is the same kind of a problem or technical adoption that we talked about earlier, learning word processors, learning how to use an internet browser, learning what to do on social media platforms, and hopefully what not to do. Those were, I don't know, fairly simple types of technical waves of adoption. Working with data is not. It's something that involves thinking fundamentally differently. It involves learning concepts that can be a little tricky, that can be, in some ways, we don't really kind of have that built-in immune system to the sorts of issues that pop up with data. So hopefully our grandkids will, maybe 3, 4, 5 year generations down the road, they'll look back at some of our struggles. And, I guess we would hope that they would look at it and say, oh, well, how funny is that they struggled with something so simple. And so that would mean we kind of did our part. Okay. Because again, what happens here with data, this idea that we're at the early stages of it, think back to the early stages of the automobile. So this is a photograph in, I think this is Los Angeles, actually, a corner there. And this is, as you can see, like the early days of the automobile. You still have some horse and buggy in there. You have clearly a lot of people walking, but you have your first cars. You have a bicycle or a motorcycle maybe. So this was actually, I don't know if you know this, but it was really, really chaotic in terms of the number of fatalities. So you start in the early 20s, right? Cars start to spread across the country. The number of automobile miles traveled increases. Now here you go today, everybody's driving Hondas. No. But if you look at the fatality rates, look what it used to be. Unbelievable in terms of the high number of fatalities. Many times pedestrians, no safety, no seatbelts, no road signs, no roads with the right quality, the cars themselves and the technology being problematic, right? And so then, as we got better and better at knowing how to drive safely, we also saw the fatality rates come down in this dual axis line chart that maybe some people might be less than thrilled with. The crossover point means nothing for those of you who know about dual axis charts. But nevertheless, we do see on the left-hand side, the blue line being vehicle miles traveled, going up and up and up. The red line, same time, 1920, dropping over that exact same period of time. Okay, so there you go, right? So the bottom line is it takes time for us to get these technologies right, for us to avoid doing damage and harm with them. We've got a long way to go to be able to say we are dealing with data in a safe way, protecting people from harm. We've got a long way to go before it's like we're driving a car down the city street with people all over the place. That's sort of what it is like today, I think, with data and how it works. So where do we go from here? And I want to kind of at least, up until now, I've just been talking about ideas and I don't know, it hasn't really been applicable. I don't think I've given you anything tangible. I think, and so if I hold myself to that standard, which I hold presenters to, then I better give you something. I better give you something useful for you to think about doing differently. Hopefully that might help you. Okay, so right now, all of that was really just kind of setting the stage. Here's where we are today. Where do we go from here? So I think that, again, this is why I believe we have to focus on this concept of data literacy. I don't think you need to call it that. Some people don't like that phrase. I totally get that. In fact, I'll get to that in a minute. Yeah, it's okay that some people don't like the phrase, and I don't care what you call it. The bottom line is we need to be able to speak data effectively one with another. Now, that whatever you call it, okay, it needs to embrace a few different, I would say, realms, or in this Venn diagram, it isn't just about numeracy and graphicacy. Those are, I think, the two cornerstones of data literacy, but there's more to it than that, like technical skills, software, programming languages, right? We need to be able to interact with data in a way that enables us to use some technical skills. And there's so many different skills that we're starting to see this fragmentation of the data world based on what tool you use. I don't think that that's the way it should be, because we're solving the same problems. We're addressing some of the same unmet needs, hopefully, and in many ways doing very similar things with slightly different tools, right? So why should we break up? And I applaud you all, this very group, for not falling into that trap, for bringing people together of different tool expertise levels, I would say. Okay. So again, that's something I think we need to build bridges. Think of it like building bridges from one tool sub-community. There's always going to be these little trade groups. That's always how it is. People that like to use this tool or that tool. It's good for them to be able to compare notes, for them to be able to network together. Totally important. I'm not saying we should stop doing that. I'm just saying we should also think of those as little islands. What are the bridges to get across them? Okay. Because again, we're doing some of the same things. We don't know that the feature is called this on that tool and that on this tool. And so those are really similar in terms of actually what they're doing with the underlying data. Clearly, we know that communication skills are important. It isn't just a question of crunching the numbers. It's a question of what we do with it, how we talk to people about it. Do we use it to get people to think differently, care differently, behave differently? Are we able to capture people's hearts and minds and be able to get them from the what to the so what? That's communication skills. Okay. It doesn't mean you have to have all these things. You can partner together with lots of people. And there's one more bubble, and that's, I would call it, some people say, oh, this business acumen, but I'll take business out because it might not be a business. It doesn't have to be a for-profit business. It could be anything. I mean, we're talking about, vaccines. We're talking about COVID data. There's a public health component to that. That's really what it is. So what's the domain? Now, the domain is interesting because a lot of times the underlying data realities are similar, but they use different terms. They're really just rates or percentages, but they have different funny little phrases and terms, or probably acronyms like CTR in marketing, click-through rate. Okay, well, that's not all that different from, something else, a sales conversion rate maybe, or something like that, right? So, but nevertheless, you're in a specific domain of your professional life. And so the fact is you've got some lexicon, dictionaries that you probably need to know and learn. And then as you maybe step out of that domain, you'll learn a new domain and see the connection and see the similarities between some of those exact same concepts, which is great. Okay, so that to me is kind of, again, at least what I see and what I think of data literacy, that's what I'm talking about. And again, I don't think you need to call it that. Because instead of, so what are we going to do differently? Well, I think we need to learn how to speak data more clearly to each other. So that's number one. We're going to talk about 7 things. Number 1, speaking data more clearly to each other. Now, I don't know about you. Did you ever learn a foreign language? I learned Spanish when I was a kid. I lived in Southern California and loved soccer, and went to a little church that had a lot of people from Central America, Mexico. And I was able to, as well as Mexico, and was able to learn that language. I love that language. I went to San Salvador. I went to Panama. I went to Cologne. I just spent some time there, loved it, learned it. Now, I got better and better as I was around other people that spoke it, and that spoke it to me, that I was able to learn and acquire it that way. So instead of just slapping up a scatter plot next time, what if we did something a little different? Now, what would it look like different? Well, how about this? What if we, instead of just saying, hey, there's your scatter plot, now we make the mistake of saying, oh, because I know it, therefore you must know it. I've been looking at this data for so long that my audience must be able to get it right away, but they're not going to get it right away. So is there a way we can get them there without burdening them with a 20-minute training seminar. What if we just said something like this? I want to show you how countries and life expectancy, how long people are expected to live, and the percentage of people living in a city, and how that's changed over time. So we'll start with a dot, and actually we'll take a dot for every country. We'll put them along this axis right here. You can see there's Cambodia on the left, there's Iceland on the right, and a lot of countries in between, and how long people were expected to live that were born in 1976. And then, well, let's not leave them all down there on the bottom line. Let's move them north vertically. And the farther up they go, that's, well, the percentages of city, like Singapore, obviously 100% there. You got other countries here that are fairly low on the percent. They're more rural citizens in those places. And why don't we actually color them by the region? So maybe, we can see the different countries and where they're located. So we see a lot of these sub-Saharan African countries over here. Okay, so that's helpful to see some of these groupings. And then, let's take it the next step. What if we size them by population? So I can see some of these countries, larger ones with more people. And then let's just go ahead and put it in motion now. We can see where these dots go. And so in about a minute or two there, I really took you from what is this thing he's showing to, oh, now I'm with him. I get what's going on with this chart. So that didn't take a long time. I didn't have to give you some half-an-hour training session on a scatter plot, right? I was able to just kind of just really quickly in maybe 20, 30 seconds, orient you on what it is I'm showing you with a couple little steps. And I think that that's a way we can change how we communicate with each other to speak data to one another in a way that doesn't assume everybody knows what you know. It's so easy for us to make that assumption, okay? So there's a tangible, hopefully, idea or suggestion there. And it's just, so Julie's calling it scaffolding. I like that word, right? Exactly. Kind of, when you have scaffolding, in a building, it's all there to build a building. Well, guess what? As soon as you got the building, you take the scaffolding away. Unless you're in New York City, it stays up. It seems like that indefinitely. So, but here I am in Bellevue, this little town outside of Seattle, and I don't see any scaffolding except on the Amazon buildings over there. And I'm pretty sure when they're up, they'll be gone. So that's really, we got to kind of put that scaffolding in place for the people we're talking to. So important. Yes, rescaffolding in NYC, yeah. And this is really, to me, what the great Hans Rosling showed us in a way that just, to me, is breathtaking, right? Not only revealing to me, myths that we have about the world, but doing it in a way that's just delightful, that just almost like he's, I don't know, calling a horse race or something. I mean, he's so excited, so animated, the data's animated. This is, to me, amazing data storytelling. It happens to use animation. It doesn't always have to, but he did that. He did just that, okay? So number two, I think we need to learn how to steer clear of some common pitfalls. So remember that little spreadsheet VisiCalc? Well, now we see these fancy visualizations, interactive graphics, things moving around again. Well, there's data pitfalls there. There's ways for us to, kind of get that wrong. And so part of it is kind of building that immune system, building that alertness to the types of pitfalls that you and I and everyone falls into. And also, by the way, having the type of culture and climate where if you happen to make a mistake like that, there's the ability to recover from that. There's the ability to learn and grow from that. And part of that, I think, is for folks like you that are part of this group, modeling that, I'm going to kind of help people in my network understand a common mistake. Maybe it's one I fell into, and being able to own that and not have it be such a terrible thing. Okay, so we need to learn how to do that. It helps us actually build a better immune system. The more we're able to talk about the sorts of mistakes that are popping up, that we're making, that they're making, that everyone's making, then as long as we allow for that, then I think we'll shorten the amount of time it takes for us to collectively build an immune system like that. Steering clear of pitfalls are so common, right? They abound. Not to shame anyone. I stumbled on this one. This is an example that kind of closes out the Learning to See data book. I remember when I came across this one, which is from the Digest of Education Statistics, right? So I remember seeing this and kind of looking at it and going, this is high school graduation rate. Sorry. So this is percentage of people that started and that graduated high school, within 4 years. And so I remember seeing this the first time I saw this. I said, oh, interesting. I didn't know Oregon had a higher graduation rate than Washington, where I live. And I was like, oh, that's interesting, and I was like, wait a minute, actually, no, it really doesn't. One's 87% for Washington, 79% for Oregon. And then I was like, oh, that was not what I expected. Because going back to the principle of expressiveness, the color scheme here, as you can see in the legend, switches the order. It doesn't necessarily show the groupings in the right order of increasing saturation. And so actually it just flips them. I've got a kind of a light green for the 70% to 80. And then I've got a super, super light green for 80 to 90. And then I've got 90 or higher is the darker version of the green. So this would be, I mean, again, I don't like to use the word violation as if I'm a cop blowing a whistle, but this is not in line with the expressiveness principle, which says that if there's order in the data, you want to choose encodings that convey that order, convey that ordinal nature of the category levels, if you will. So we can think about, redesigning this one. This was done in Data Wrapper over here. I said, well, if I just take the raw data and I, use a sliding scale, this is not rocket science, right? This is not anything that you don't know how to do and have done a million times, but there are still many examples of people that aren't really kind of, doing that. This might just be software defaults. Who knows? This might be someone's boss told them. I don't know. So many reasons and ways that this chart on the left could have been produced the way it was produced. And so, again, and if also, let's say I wanted to know the states that are above or below the US average. Good luck doing that, right? The US average, I think, is 81%. And so I can't tell. Now, if I use 85% rather, if I use a diverging color palette, that facilitates a totally different question. And that's a different question that maybe you have, maybe you don't have. But the fact of the matter is, you might create a completely compliant visualization that doesn't actually help someone answer the question they have. Because no visualization can be designed to answer every possible conceivable question, right? So it's part of that is understanding our audience. What are they trying to do? What questions do they have? If you need to know the states quickly that are above or below the national average, well, this is going to help you do that a lot faster than the other one would, okay? Obviously, we want to avoid red and blue for reasons that we can all relate to after this last fall, unless, by the way, clearly we're showing political data. So even with a diverging color palette that does show above or below the national average, well, the specific color hues we choose on either ends of that diverging scale might actually, trip us up. Why? Because our audience might assume they're seeing something about political data and kind of get confused or what have you, right? So it's just a barrier. It becomes a barrier to the understanding. Because red-blue in a US map is automatically expressive for some, not everyone, but for many of the political spectrum. And so that's something we need to take into account. Different cultures, by the way, are going to have completely different assumptions. The left to right time convention, as Barbara Tversky talks about in her book, Mind in Motion, is very common for people who learn to read and write with a language that's left to right, okay? On the other hand, if you talk to someone who learned Arabic, they're going to perhaps, or another right to left language, they'll start by assuming that progression of time is right to left. Interestingly, children who grew up in Israel, who learned Hebrew, might actually be mixed on that because they learn, at least as far as Tversky talks about in her book, they learn to read and write language left to right. They learn to write numbers right to left. So, you might get a mixed bag there for them. So those are all conventions. Those are all, things we need to kind of be aware of. Also be aware that our assumptions might not be the same as our audience's assumptions. I think we need to embrace that data literacy, any kind of literacy, is not binary. It isn't like this is a huge thing to avoid. And I think this is part of the problem we might fall into as we look at society. Oh, they're data literate. They're not. Well, that isn't going to be helpful. And I've found, and as I've talked to people, I've found that can be a trap. And what happens there is it's because the person who considers themselves data literate really isn't just doing a very good job of communicating. And they're just now pointing the finger and saying, well, that's because this person is quote unquote illiterate. A former colleague of mine, Michael Correll, who was at Tableau, still is, I believe, wrote a great blog post like 2 weeks before I left Tableau to start data literacy, called What Does Visualization Literacy Mean Anyway? So I had to have a sense of humor about that. He talks about how the word literacy in some ways, doesn't serve us well because we might fall into that trap of thinking you're either or, like a switch. And that's not how it is. Actually, how it is more like we think about reading. There's reading levels. This is a national assessment of adult literacy. What do we've got here? Different levels: below basic, intermediate, proficient. Remember as a kid growing up, what did we learn? Reading levels. Oh, I'm a third grader at a fourth grade reading level. What does that mean? Well, there are varying degrees of difficulty of texts, and you have varying degrees of ability to understand what that text is saying. And there's the same thing with data, right? It's a sliding scale. And so we talk about training people who are data phobic, giving them that foundation to help them start and break into it, just getting them comfortable with what data is, how it might apply to them, stepping them up from there. We might need to retrain some of the experts. I know many times people I consider incredibly wise and experienced with data have needed to learn something new. They have needed to go back, and there was a piece of their foundational knowledge or skills that was missing. Because it's a pretty complex set of skills and knowledge to acquire. No one can really get it all. So you might get to a place in your career, in your data usage, where you realize, you know what, I need to go back actually and put something in place that I didn't learn the way I needed to learn. This is a people thing, but it can't be just about training, right? So yes, we need training. Yes, we need to train each other, retrain each other, totally. But this can't just be some training wave. It just really can't. That's not it, right? Because the problem is effective use of data involves way more than just skills, because we really need to bring into view many other aspects of what it means to work together in groups and work with data in those groups. For example, you might have a lot of really intelligent, savvy data experts on your team. They may not have the tools that they need to use. They may not have the data. They might have the tools and the data, and frustratingly, the company's or organization's processes don't even let them contribute. Why? Because they just hired those smart people, gave them a bunch of fancy tools, but they did it so that they could have that feather in their cap. And we've all heard of that, right? And the people that make the decisions in the organization continue making the decisions in the organization the way they've always made them. And then the smart people come and they say there's data that would suggest otherwise, and they don't want to hear that, right? And then those people leave. So this is a failure of data literacy, isn't it? It has nothing to do with the tools or the skills of the people. It has everything to do with the processes. So all of these things, these little kind of big aspects or elements of the organization's inner workings need to be considered as we talk about closing the data literacy gap. So what are those different elements? What are the problems or barriers in each of those elements? This is what we do with our data literacy score when we work with teams. Part of it is people feel, this is one of the most common complaints we see, they just feel like they don't get the data. They don't have access to it, or maybe they do, but it's so disparate and complex and convoluted. This whole data landscape, they just don't even know where to begin to navigate it. So, we're seeing things like data catalogs, high-tech solutions to this problem. Really, this is an organization problem. Really, this is an access problem, and I think a trust problem, perhaps, on some level. But, this needs to be done with care. There are balancing forces like governance, like privacy, that need to be brought into. So it isn't just as simple as saying, free the data, all the data. Well, I hope you don't do that to my data, right? Company X. So yes, we need to free the data, get it in the hands of people to work with it. But we need to do that within reason, within bounds. These are not easy things to solve. These are challenges. These are, again, finding the happy medium, finding the balance between two different extremes, neither of which would be healthy. Okay, a couple more things here. Last one, and I put this last one, but this is really the first one, because we talked about that horse and buggy from the corner in LA. Well, look, these companies all over the world have put the cart before the horse. We didn't put in place principles of data ethics. And by that, I don't just mean we're going to make some code and make everybody swear by it. I mean, it's a lot more complex than that, as you know. Sometimes we do things with data and we don't understand the ramifications of it. But I think we need to at least start to try better and do different things as it relates to doing no harm with data. So there are some things about that. There's a book about data ethics. I think it's free, maybe. It's an O'Reilly book by Hillary Mason. And I can't remember his name anymore off the top of my head, but it was President Obama's chief data officer. Someone will know, hopefully. But and also one of the editors from O'Reilly Media published a book on a free book. I think you can find on Amazon on data ethics. And this is an organization. This is actually datapractices.org. I was a part of the group of people that put together this set of principles that you can look at and tweak and change and make it work for you. And if you like it as is, you can sign on the datapractices.org site and add your name to the list of people that are kind of advocating for this kind of approach. But look at what's on the list, right? Aiming to using data to improve lives. Reproducible work so people can see what we've done, right? Choosing teams with diverse ideas, backgrounds, and strengths. Number 4, prioritizing continuous collection and availability of discussions and metadata. What do people say about the data? What issues do they find? Can we have there be a record of that instead of it just being lost into the Slack ether? Okay, so you get it, right? These are ways we can work together and put data ethics first. Make sure that no one wants to work for a company that's not ethical with data. You don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want my team to have that. So I think it behooves us to at least kind of have that conversation, knowing that, again, it's not as easy as it sounds. Sometimes we do something and we find out later on down the road that was harmful. And we realize maybe we should have known that. Maybe we could have predicted that. Maybe it would have been very difficult to predict. And in that case, how can we take that and incorporate that into the learnings of the organization? So putting the horse before the cart by making sure that there are guardrails in place, to keep us from doing harm with data. That's where I would like to work in an organization, that I felt safe that I wasn't going to hurt someone with data, and that it had this organizational kind of awareness of how to do that, right, and what to avoid. Okay, so then I think, and then when it comes to culture, that's an all hands on deck kind of a thing. I think the leaders play, as we've seen, a huge role in setting the tone for the culture. What are you doing to enable people, to promote, and to reward them for being data literate? Okay, and if people see that, people get that, and they sense right away, what are the things that are effective in this group of people? What are the things that will help me get ahead within this group or this team? And so, are those things related to making effective use of data, or are those things, more about making the right person look good, or I don't know, making the company more money? Well, that might be part of it, but with what other principles is it coupled in order to prevent what we've seen? Capitalism without a conscience. Okay, so that's a cultural aspect and element. Okay, so I think we need to go from minding the gap to closing the gap. First, we need to know there's a gap. Hopefully, I've been able to convince you of that and illustrate that in clear terms. And hopefully I've given you a few things for you to hang your hat on to be able to close the gap a little bit, little by little by little. All right. So I'll actually send directly to Cameron and Naomi, if it's okay, a little PDF to send to everyone in the group or post to your site. You may not need this, but you probably know someone who does. These are some tips for you to be able to break down a chart and learn how to read it and interpret it, different elements or aspects that we may overlook. This, again, is really capturing Mary Eleanor Spears and her challenge to us to go beyond looking at a chart and actually seeing it. So with that, here's how you can get a hold of me. And I would love to stop there and see if you have any thoughts or comments. And thank you, Hope. You're exactly right. That's the one. Yep. And it was DJ Patil was the name that escaped me. So thank you, for putting that link in there. But thank you everyone for listening, for tuning in, for sharing your thoughts in the comments. And wanted to stop there and kind of, I guess, maybe Cameron, you want to take it over and see if there's any questions to have a conversation together. It doesn't have to just involve me. Maybe you all can chat too, whatever you want to do.
Thank you so much, Ben. If anybody would like to ask their question, just leave a note in the chat and I can unmute you. while people are thinking, one question I had when you shared the automobile example,
Yeah.
we saw the miles traveled by vehicles versus the fatalities. I was curious
Yeah.
if you have thoughts about what an equivalent of an automobile fatality might be
In
in
the
the
data
practice
world.
of data graphics. Yeah.
Yeah. So this idea of like, what are we counting over here on the left, on the, well, actually the right-hand side of the dual axis chart? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, that's probably harder to count, right? But I mean, I guess um, it would be to me, I mean, obviously fatality, you'd say, well, this is where you actually did harm with data. So I think the most egregious forms of that, there have been plenty of examples of, um, algorithms that have sought to convert data that have resulted in incredible harm done to people. Not always involving death, but let me throw a couple out there. I actually have a spreadsheet going of known, at least instances or stories anyway, of harm caused by AI as reflected in the news. Okay, now this harm could be everything from the CEO in China whose face was put up on a board of jaywalkers, but it was because her face was on a bus that passed by the camera. So that might seem comical, but in some level, there's some harm done there or could be done as it relates to people being identified or publicly shamed, perhaps, for certain behaviors that they may not be guilty of at all. Clearly, we know that data has, since it itself includes or has been gathered from an incredibly biased world, has a tendency sometimes to propagate those biases. I think ProPublica did a great job talking about recidivism. This is the likelihood of a felon who has gone and done their time and left, going back into jail, and how some of the algorithms that predict that are used in policing really just propagate some of that bias that has existed within policing for decades. And so, there's another example of data in the credit world as well. People, there's stories of people. This is in the dirty data world, but you may have heard of these elderly individuals who were denied Medicare or given dramatically scaled back levels of care because of errors in software codes that were seeking to convert their symptoms and conditions to matching it to a certain level of coverage or care. Okay. And so, those are examples where it's very difficult to, even the people buying the software off the shelf and using it in their local area to help hopefully try to manage care. Those are people doing that with conscientious minds for the most part. And, here they are, right? Like putting some people in really hard circumstances, and they don't even know, and they have no way to figure that out until all of a sudden people are saying, why are all these groups of people saying that this is not fair, what's happening? And then sometimes that's the only way. Why? Because they couldn't go into the code or see where the algorithm was getting the data wrong. Or, I mean, that wasn't something they were capable of doing. You could say that the software developers maybe should have caught it, potentially, yes. But those are anyway, a handful of examples I can think of. To me, it's just anytime you have data, it's algorithms, the tools that are using that data actually do harm to people or a group of people. And we all know that, that's disproportionately spread in the world. And so I think we know where to start. But those are some examples that come to mind. I'm curious if anyone else has thoughts on that.
Something that I really appreciate about that answer is that these examples that you provide, they're harder to count than we'll just measure the average temperature changing over time. But that doesn't mean that that the way to keep track of this impact is to lean towards something that can be measured with a number. Because ultimately it's about the impact that is had on people, and your answer really focused on that.
Yep. Exactly. I'll try to see if I can dig up that little list, but yeah, it looks like there's a couple other questions on here maybe. Cameron, should I let you go through and find the next one? Or do you want me to
There's
dive
one
in?
here that's pretty specific to New York. I would generalize it. So Jacqueline has a question about companies that are especially good at consuming data or producing it ethically.
Companies that are really good at producing data or consuming it ethically. Yeah, companies. I would, let me bounce that back to the group, because the ProPublica comes to mind. I think they are a not-for-profit news organization that is seeking to shine the spotlight on the exact opposite of that, which is examples and instances of, in society, abuse or harm done by data. Let's see, what are other companies that might fall on that list, or groups? B Corps. Yeah, so a B Corp is going to, in fact, that's something we're trying to get soon too, but a B Corp is going to have a for-profit company. As you all know, it's going to have a public benefit baked into its principles and such. And so in many ways, yeah, I would say that's an example of a type of a company. So like maybe like data.world or something down in Austin, Texas. It's a data catalog that has a public facing catalog, and they're sharing data on that platform. They're a B corporation. I know that from talking to their founder, Brett. So there's an example of another one. I'm trying to think of other ones. Maybe technologies and discrimination looks like. Cool, there's a link coming through here. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner. Interesting. Yeah, you got me there, really, Jacqueline. I don't think I have a long list of companies that I know of that I would say are incredibly data ethical. I don't know that that means that they don't exist. I just think at the moment it's kind of escaping me. Yeah. Algorithms of Oppression is a good resource on this. Cool. Thank you, Stephanie. Cool. Yeah. Revealing how negative biases against women and of color are embedded in search engine results. Exactly. Yeah. Let me see if I can just, give me a minute. I want to find this little spreadsheet. It's just a Google Docs kind of a thing, but it came because I don't like to really, I saw someone who's pretty knowledgeable in the ML AI world saying that he didn't think that data or AI had done harm, or he certainly knew of no examples of that. And I was really shocked. And so, I didn't really want to like get in some nasty debate. I just said, oh, how interesting, that's your perspective. I think I have a little list of ones, at least that I've become aware of. So I challenged myself to go back and say, instead of getting into some, nasty public debate, I just wanted to say, I would love to hear your perspective about these instances that certainly seem to me like they're showing people getting hurt by data and algorithms used against that data. Here we go, examples of allegedly harmful data algorithms. So I'll put this link in the chat, and it's actually set to open status. So, oops, sorry. So you can go in and check it out, and these are just a couple dozen, a little more than that, maybe, examples, and people are adding to it, which is cool. So I'll just get this share. But yeah, I think that there are probably other great examples as well. Let me copy this link. Sorry, seeing email addresses on there. I'm not sure who those people were, but I'll put this over here in the chat. There you go. Let me send this to everyone in the meeting. Here you go. Okay, there we go. So that was just an example of, ones that I'm not an expert here, but I've been collecting them. Every time I see one, I put it in there. So, photo app mislabeling Black people, New Zealand passport robot, kind of saying things to people that certainly wouldn't be something you'd want to say. So women getting fewer ads related to higher paying job than men, right? So these are all based on algorithms. And you can say, well, that's just software, or there are processes there. And so, yeah, absolutely. But anyway, feel free to take a look at this, add to this. I think there's a place to put comments in there too. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of examples of it, right? And we can sit here and wring our hands and say, oh, well, let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we got to work on these and get them right. We've got to work on what caused that to happen. I mean, we're talking about people's lives being affected in really sad and negative ways, right? So, I mean, it seems like it's the only humane thing to do, to try to take it seriously and try to figure out what can be done a little differently. And I would love to know if others have examples of organizations that are doing this really well. That might be a second tab on here. The flip side of this coin is, what are examples where data was used to fix such an issue? Maybe I should be doing that. I should be also collecting that list. It's a little more of a positive list. So any other questions there, Cameron, that we can, okay, thanks, Jacqueline. Yeah, please do.
That's awesome. And as we make a page for this event, we'll make sure to post this spreadsheet and related things so people can find it later. Looks like Sai has a question.
Hi, Ben.
Hey there. Nice to see you again.
Nice.
Good. How are you?
Always. I'm really well, thank you.
Good.
So you touched a little bit on platform evolution and its impact on data visualization. And I wondered just what your thoughts are on how the AR, VR, and sort of like extended reality space in general, because that's coming up huge, and we're going to see a huge disruption in that space. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on data literacy in that space.
I think I have a bet right now on the table with Elijah Meeks that sometime before 2030, there'll be an example of VR and AR using three-dimensional data visualization to help us do something breakthrough.
Well,
we perhaps couldn't do.
I'm working on that.
And that is, yeah. So I'm on the, I'm on the believer side. I feel like, there's good reason why we have, as a community, as a group of practitioners and trainers and teachers, really discouraged people from using the Z-axis, because we're projecting that either on a screen or a surface, something two-dimensional. It's really hard to see what's going on there. We all know that. I'm preaching to the choir on that. But I mean, to me, if you take away that two-dimensional presentation limitation, well, it seems like to reason to me that then therefore there could be the way for us to be sort of Star Wars Moon of Endor scenario, standing around a room with a three-dimensional data visualization in space, in front of us, in between us, next to us, right? For us to be able to do something with that. I'm open to it. I know other people aren't, and it's a friendly wager, I think. But yeah, I feel like there should be a way that new technology, and I think that we're still, spending time knocking down the barriers of adoption, as we all know from the Google Glass experiment. So eventually, though, I think that those sorts of technological snafus are going to be solved, or the kinks ironed out on that. And then we will be looking at data potentially in the three-dimensional space, AR having it projected onto a surface, VR actually being in a separate reality. So yeah, I feel like definitely that's coming. And I would love to be a part of it or see it happen. Like I said, I'm excited about the possibilities. Great to know people like you are thinking about that, because I mean, don't you immediately, you probably get more than a 50% increase in the potential to glean information because you go from 2 axes to 3, but maybe it's even more than that, right? Maybe
and that's where my concern with literacy comes into the whole idea is that, so there hasn't been a lot of evolution in chart types. There has, but there hasn't. We haven't really invented new ways of visualizing data that aren't building on an existing model, basically. And sort of AR, VR, these sort of extended reality environments aren't going to slow down. And my concern is jamming 2D models into a three-dimensional space where we were able to pull it from the newspaper onto the web page because the space matched, it made sense.
Yeah.
Whereas when we're moving into a three-dimensional space, do we need to create new models for visualization for this new space rather than, and so then we have this data literacy that we're working on this type while we're having this potential, you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it would be hard to imagine having a breakthrough technology. How would you layer that or deploy that into a world that has some of the data literacy challenges that we have today? That would be a potential kind of liability for that software, or potentially a blocker to that software or that new application. And I like the idea. I mean, I would, kind of love to hear more about that. What it means to do something other than simply porting over our current frames of reference into a three-dimensional space. But those are the kinds of things I think people are going to figure out and solve. And that's going to be the reason why maybe some of the naysayers, like my good friend Elijah, I don't know, who knows, maybe we'll all be laughing at this, naively optimistic Ben in 10 years. I don't know. But like I said, I feel like that it's coming. I feel like, we'll figure out some of these new paradigms, and maybe it's because I'm a sci-fi geek and I liked Minority Report. I don't know. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think we're gonna get there though. And even like not in a very practical way. And maybe it relates to actually being able to see the world around us with data elements in it, in a way that gives us information as we interact with the world that would have not really been possible in terms of the speed of transmission of that information. So yeah, cool. I'm glad to hear that people are working on it and that you're working on it. And like I said, you're going to win me $100 bet if you pull it off. So we'll split it. I don't know. How about that?
Love it. We can go out for drinks and appetizers.
He said $1 million, and I was like, I don't know what kind of money you're dealing with, man. I can't even talk about it. My kids would never allow me. So, but anyway, yeah, no, great question. And like I said, I'm hopeful because, hey, I mean, if it allows us to solve some of the problems we have not been able to solve in our world, then by all means, let's embrace it and figure out how to use it. Yeah.
Love that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
So I know we're running close to our originally scheduled time. Do you have time for more questions, Ben, or should people follow up with you on Twitter or similar?
Yeah, let's do that. So let's wrap it up. I got to run, and again, here's my little contact sheet here. Feel free to reach out to me. And it was a great chat. I love the questions and comments that came through all along. So yeah, thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate your time, and all the best to you. Have a good rest of your week. And let's, if you have other ideas of ways that we can work together to close the data literacy gap, I'm all ears.
Hi, I want to just thank everybody for coming. Thank Ben for speaking, and thanks to Cameron for hosting us once again. Again, thanks to everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks, everybody.